Hello there, everyone. This is Mr. Rose, and I apologize that I'm not with you in person to take you through this, but this is my PETAL paragraphing, a how-to guide. So, before we even begin writing our PETAL paragraph, we need to understand one of the most important ideas in a comparative essay. Your evidence needs to connect. So, one of the biggest mistakes that many students make is choosing random quotes that they like instead of collecting evidence that actually supports the same argument. So remember, a body paragraph is not just one quote from each text and another random quote from the other text. Each paragraph should focus on one clear idea about the theme, and both pieces of evidence need to support that same idea. Think of it like building a bridge. Your paragraph focus is the bridge itself, and your evidence from both the texts are the supports that holds it up. If one quote doesn't connect to the idea, the paragraph becomes weak. So before you even start collecting evidence, ask yourself, what is the exact idea that I'm trying to prove in this paragraph? That question will guide every decision you make. So today, I'm going to look at the theme of innocence in Night and the Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. This is one that we've been kind of looking at in class, seeing what we can do together. So we're going to look at how can we build a connected comparative analysis instead of isolated observations. Now, paragraph 2. Let's have a look at how innocence is destroyed through that exposure to reality. So this paragraph is no longer about misunderstanding. It's about the change. Now we ask, where do the characters lose their innocence? If you're looking at a topic like relationships, you might ask yourself, where do characters' relationships start to fracture? Your paragraph 1 may have been that relationships are important. Paragraph 2 may be that relationships are starting to fracture. And your paragraph 3 may be that relationships become that sort of burden. So, for this particular paragraph, Eliezer arrives at Auschwitz and witnesses unimaginable suffering. This moment completely destroys his former understanding of the world. If we remember back to, I feel like it might be maybe section 3 or section 4, he has that repetition of never shall I forget that night. So, this quote is powerful because it captures that turning point. There is a clear before and after. Before this moment, we have Eliezer as innocent, he's trusting, and he's faithful. But after this moment, he becomes traumatized. He's fearful, and he's psychologically changed. Meanwhile, Bruno slowly begins noticing restrictions, secrecy, and tension around him. Although he still doesn't fully understand the Holocaust, he begins moving closer to reality. So again, notice how both examples show innocence changing. They both connect to the exposure of truth, and they both support the same paragraph focus. Once again, this is why choosing evidence matters so much. The quote itself is not enough. What matters is the why does this quote support your argument. Let's have a look now at our paragraph 2. I'm not going to show you paragraph 1 or paragraph 3, but we're going to see how can we put this together. So, before we start writing, let's have a look at this one here. Our paragraph focus is innocence through the exposure of reality. So everything we write from this point onwards must connect back to this idea. And this is where students often go wrong. Sometimes they include unrelated quotes, maybe they talk about random techniques, or analysis that drifts away from the paragraph focus. Every sentence in PETAL paragraphing should work together like a chain. If one sentence does not connect to the argument, it weakens the paragraph. So constantly ask yourself, how does this sentence prove my idea? That question will keep you focused and analytical. Now we're moving into that PETAL. So the first step is P for point. Your point sentence is your argument for the paragraph. This is the sentence that tells your marker, this is what I'm going to prove. And because the marker reads it first, it needs to be clear, it needs to be direct, and it needs to be connected to your essay question or your thesis. A weak point sentence creates confusion immediately. For example, a weak point sentence might sound like this: both texts show innocence. That's too vague. A strong point sentence explains how innocence is shown and what idea is being explored through that. The point sentence is like the roadmap for the paragraph. Everything else follows from it. So here is our example. In both night and where is it? Sorry. There it is. So in both Night and the Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, innocence is shown as something that is fragile, that is gradually destroyed through exposure to the horrors of the Holocaust. So let's break down why this works. So firstly, it references to the both texts immediately. Second, it uses the key theme. We mention innocence. And thirdly, it explains how innocence is represented here. And lastly, it introduces the idea of destruction through trauma. So just this sentence tells the marker what the paragraph is about, what argument is being explored, and where the analysis is heading. A strong point sentence creates confidence in your writing from the very beginning. So let's have a look at the formula. Here is a really simple formula that you can use. Start with in both texts. Then name your theme, explain how it is shown, and optionally explain how strongly or to what extent it is. This formula is useful because it gives that structure. Students often think sophisticated writing means making things complicated and using big words, but it doesn't. Sophisticated writing comes from clear arguments, logical organization, and thoughtful analysis. A formula is not there to restrict you, it's there to support you until this structure becomes natural. We then move into our finding evidence and explaining. So this is where many students lose marks because they simply drop quotes into the paragraph without giving some sort of context or explanation. Remember, the marker may know the text, but your job is to explain the moment clearly. So before using your quote, make sure you explain what is happening. Establish the context and then embed the quote naturally. Strong evidence is not necessarily the longest or most dramatic quote. Strong evidence is relevant, it's connected to the argument, and it's rich with the techniques that you can analyze. You're not collecting quotes because they sound fancy. You're collecting evidence because it helps prove your point. So let's actually apply this process to our paragraph. So here's our first piece of evidence from Night. We're going to use that quote of "Never shall I forget that night." So our evidence there. This is evident when Eliezer arrives at Auschwitz and begins to lose his naive understanding of the world, recalling that "never shall I forget that night." Notice how this sentence works. Before the quote even appears, we explain the context, we explain what's happening, and we connect it directly to the idea of innocence being destroyed. The quote's not just floating randomly in the paragraph, it's embedded naturally into a sentence. So let's compare this to the second text. Similarly, Bruno's innocence is shown when he misinterprets the camp, believing the prisoners are simply wearing striped pajamas. Again, notice that I've given context, I've given quote, and then I've connected it to the paragraph focus. This is what the comparative writing should sound like. You should constantly be moving between the texts rather than discussing one text completely, then moving to the next. That comparison is what makes a paragraph analytical and cohesive. Another really important thing as well is keep your quotes short. Students sometimes copy massive chunks of text and then barely analyze them. A short quote is usually much stronger because it keeps the focus on your ideas, it allows more room for analysis, and it forces you to explain meaning rather than relying on the quote itself. Quotes do not analyze themselves. You are the one creating meaning. Now, here is that formula that you can follow whenever you're introducing evidence. So you can start with this is evident when, or this is shown when. Then explain the context. Give me some sort of idea about what is happening at that time. Embed that short quote and then compare using simile or some other text connectives. This structure is really effective because it forces your writing to stay analytical instead of becoming a plot summary. A lot of students accidentally retell the story. For example, they might say Eliezer goes to Auschwitz, then he feels traumatized. That's a recount. Analysis sounds different. Analysis explains significance. Instead, we would write Eliezer's arrival at Auschwitz destroys his former understanding of humanity. That focuses on meaning instead of events. So, whenever you introduce evidence, ask yourself, am I retelling the story or am I explaining why this moment matters? That question will instantly improve your writing. Now we move into T for technique. This is where we analyze how meaning is created. A technique is not just something you identify to tick a box. The technique is the method that an author or a director uses to shape or position the audience. For novels, techniques could include repetition, you've got symbolism, imagery, tone, metaphor, or you may use dialogue. For films, techniques might include lighting, costume, camera angles, facial expressions, or music. And this is really important because when you analyze films, try and use film techniques. Students often only analyze dialogue from films, but films create meaning visually as well. That demonstrates a stronger awareness of form. So when you're collecting your evidence, always ask, what technique is helping communicate the theme here? If you cannot find a technique in the evidence, it may not be the strongest quote to use. So let's apply techniques to our evidence. In Night, the quote, never shall I forget that night, uses repetition. So the repeated phrasing mirrors that permanence of trauma and memory. Meanwhile, in The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, the phrase striped pajamas uses costume symbolism. Bruno sees uniforms as pajamas because of his innocence and misunderstanding. Now, notice how we turn those observations into analytical sentences. So instead of saying the technique is repetition, for example, we could explain the effect. So, what we need to do is we would say, Vizel's use of repetition in Never Shall I Forget That Night highlights the permanence of Eliezer's psychological trauma. And we would say Herman's use of costume symbolism through the striped pajamas reinforces Bruno's misunderstanding of the concentration camp. This is the difference between identifying techniques and analyzing techniques. A weak analysis would be an author uses repetition. Strong analysis, the author uses repetition to emphasize the permanence of trauma. Always explain why the technique matters. Why is the author using that technique? Just needs to be one simple sentence. Here is that technique formula. So start with the author or the director's use of, then identify the technique. Refer to the quote and explain the effect using verbs like highlights, reinforces, reveals, emphasizes. These verbs are important because they push your writing into analysis. So compare these two examples. If I say the quote uses symbolism, or the symbolism reinforces Bruno's innocence and misunderstanding. See the difference? The second version actually explains meaning. This is what markers are looking for. Another important thing as well is avoid technique dumping. Sometimes students want to say the author uses symbolism, imagery, metaphor, repetition, and tone. That does not automatically create a good analysis. It's much better to choose one strong technique, explain it clearly, and connect it deeply to the theme. Depth is the most important rather than listing techniques. We now reach my favorite paragraph section. This is the hardest part. A is for analysis. This is the section where students move beyond identifying quotes and identifying techniques, and they actually explain the deeper meaning. This is where you answer questions like, why does it matter? What message is being communicated? What does the audience learn? How are they positioned? And how does this connect to the theme? This is where students often fall into recount. So remember, you're not retelling the story, you're explaining the significance. Think about it like this: evidence tells us what happened, analysis explains why it matters. That's the difference. So instead of writing Eliezer was traumatized, we need to go deeper and to say, why was he traumatized? So maybe the destruction of Eliezer's innocence reveals how extreme suffering dismantles a child's sense of morality, faith, and identity. That is analysis because it explores ideas beyond the surface level. So let's look at our full example of comparative analysis. Wiesel's use of repetition in Never Shall I Forget That Night emphasizes the permanence of Eliezer's psychological trauma, revealing that innocence, once lost, cannot be recovered. That's what we had previously, so we need to have that clear connection. Notice how this analysis links to the technique, it links to the theme, and it explains a deeper message. Then we continue. This cyclical phrasing mirrors the inescapability of memory, suggesting that the Holocaust destroys not only physical lives, but also a child's sense of trust and moral certainty. We're exploring identity, trauma, and psychological destruction. Then we compare the second text. In contrast, Herman's use of costume symbolism through the striped pajamas reinforces Bruno's misunderstanding of reality, highlighting how his innocence is defined by ignorance rather than experience. And we bring those two texts together. However, this innocence is ultimately dangerous as it prevents him from recognizing the true nature of his environment. Together, both texts construct innocence as something inherently fragile, either violently stripped away through suffering or maintained through a lack of understanding, ultimately revealing that innocence cannot survive in the face of systemic cruelty. That final comparison is extremely important. Strong comparative essays constantly connect the texts together. They do not analyze them separately. So, how do we put this together? So, an analysis formula, this could be useful. Use sentence starters like this shows, this suggests, in contrast, similarly, together, both texts. This helps guide your thinking and keeps your writing analytical. So, for example, this shows that Eliezer's innocence is permanently damaged by trauma. Then you would say this suggests that exposure to suffering strips individuals of their former identity and beliefs. Then make that comparison. So, in contrast, Bruno's innocence is preserved through ignorance. And finally, together, both texts highlight the fragility of innocence in the face of human cruelty. Notice how each sentence deepens the analysis further. You're getting closer and closer to the why. Think of it like the Titanic hitting the iceberg. You want to make sure the Titanic sinks to the bottom so you see the full picture and you see the full iceberg. You're building you are building ideas step by step instead of stopping after one simple observation. We then move to the last section. This is our link. So, when we're looking at our link, a lot of students think that the link sentence is just repeating the point again, but it's not actually what the link does. Your link sentence should bring your ideas together. It needs to connect back to the essay question and reinforce the overall argument of the paragraph. Think of it as the final message of the paragraph. By the time the marker reaches the link sentence, they should clearly understand what your paragraph argued, how the evidence supported that argument, and what overall idea the text is communicating. A weak link sentence might sound like, "This shows that innocence is important." That's too vague and simplistic. A strong linking sentence revisits the argument with sophistication and confidence. Remember, you are not introducing new ideas here. You are reinforcing the significance of the analysis you've already explored. So let's have a look at our example now. Ultimately, both Knight and the boy in the striped pajamas demonstrate that innocence is either forcibly destroyed through lived trauma or dangerously sustained through ignorance, revealing that it cannot survive within the reality of the Holocaust. So let's break down why this works. Firstly, it refers to both texts. Secondly, it directly uses the key theme in there. You see that I say the word innocence. Thirdly, it summarizes the argument developed throughout the paragraph that it is dangerous. And lastly, it leaves the reader with a strong overall idea about human suffering and the Holocaust. This is important because sophisticated essays do not simply identify themes. They explore what the themes suggest about those events and those themes. Notice how this sentence does not just say innocence is destroyed. Instead, it explains how innocence is destroyed, why it matters, and what message the audience is left with. That deeper conceptual thinking is what pushes writing into higher achievement levels. So let's have a look at our linking formula. Start with a text connective like ultimately or both texts show. Then refer to both texts. Restate the theme, explain the overall idea, and finish with a message being communicated. So you've seen in that example at the bottom there, ultimately both Knight and the boy in the striped pajamas show that innocence cannot survive the realities of the Holocaust, as it either destroyed through trauma or is maintained through dangerous ignorance. This formula is really effective because it helps your paragraph end with clarity and purpose. You want your marker to finish reading the paragraph thinking, this student clearly understands the theme and how both texts construct meaning. That is your goal. So now that we have gone through every section individually, let's put that together and see how each part connects. So this is the complete petal paragraph. In both Knight and the boy in the striped pajamas, innocence is shown as something fragile that is gradually destroyed through exposure to the horrors of the Holocaust. This is evident when Eliezer arrives at Auschwitz and begins to lose his naive understanding of the world, recalling that "never shall I forget this night." Similarly, Bruno's innocence is shown when he misinterprets the camp, believing the prisoners are simply wearing striped pajamas. Wiesel's use of repetition in "Never Shall I Forget That Night" highlights the permanence of Eliezer's psychological trauma, revealing that innocence, once lost, cannot be recovered. This cyclical phrasing mirrors the inescapability of memory and suggesting that the Holocaust destroys not only physical lives, but also a child's trust, faith, and moral certainty. In contrast, Herman's use of costume symbolism through the striped pajamas reinforces Bruno's misunderstanding of reality, highlighting how this innocence is shaped through ignorance rather than experience. Together, both texts construct innocence as inherently fragile, revealing that it cannot survive environments shaped by systemic cruelty and suffering. Ultimately, both Knight and the boy in the striped pajamas demonstrate that innocence is either forcibly destroyed through trauma or dangerously sustained through ignorance, revealing that it cannot endure within the realities of the Holocaust. So, that first sentence was my point. My next two sentences are my evidence and my explain. The discussion about repetition and the costume symbolism is my technique. That deeper discussion about trauma, trust, ignorance, and suffering becomes my analysis, and that final sentence is my link. Notice how every sentence connects back to the same paragraph focus. That's what makes the paragraph cohesive. So, remember, when you are writing a petal paragraph, start with a clear argument. Then, collect connected evidence, explain the context, identify meaningful techniques, analyze the deeper meanings, and link everything back to the question. But most importantly, do not just tell the marker what happened. Anyone can recount the plot. Strong English students explain why the moment matters, how meaning is created, and what the audience learns from it, how they're positioned. That's the difference between basic writing and sophisticated literary analysis. So, next time you sit down to write a petal paragraph, stop thinking, what quotes can I use? And instead ask yourself, what argument am I trying to prove? Because once your argument is clear, the evidence, techniques, and analysis become much easier to construct. I wish you the best of luck in writing your petal paragraph. Thank you.